Hi guys, welcome back to another tutorial. Today's video will be a quick one on how to draft a basic skirt pattern for beginners. So let's get started. So right here I have my pattern paper, my scissors, my straight ruler, my curved ruler, measuring tape and my pen. Now when I cut out my pattern paper, I made sure it was wide enough to accommodate a quarter of my hip circumference plus about 2 to 3 inches allowance. And for the length, that's completely up to you. You can make it as long or as short as you want the skirt to be. So these are the measurements we'll be needing for this tutorial. So let's get straight into it. So first I created a border on each side of the pattern paper. You don't have to do this. This is just something I wanted to do. So this measures 13 inches, which is my hip circumference divided by 4 plus 2 inches for allowance. And this end right here will be my center front. So I'll go ahead and indicate that. Now I'm just going to be coming down from the top of my pattern paper by 1 inch. I'll go ahead and mark that point across, square it out with my ruler, and that line will become my start line / waistline. And from that line, I'll be taking the rest of my measurements. And I'm starting with my waist to hip measurement at 8.5 inches. So go ahead and measure from your waist to your hip. Mark that point downwards from the start line. So after marking my waist to hip measurement, I'll be bringing in my ruler to square out that point, and that line will become my hip line. Next, I'll be marking the full length of the skirt, and because my pattern paper is not long, I'll be working with 21 inches plus 2 inches for hemming allowance. So that's 23 inches total, and I can always make this longer or shorter depending on what I want. So I'm placing my tape from the start line and I'm coming down by 23 inches. So you go ahead and mark out the full length of your skirt. I'll be marking that across, then I'll bring in my ruler to square out that point. Now I'll be moving on to work on the waistline. And the first thing I'll be doing is to mark a quarter of my waist circumference. So go ahead and mark your waist circumference divided by 4 along the waistline. And to that measurement, I'll be adding 1 inch for the darts that will be added to the skirt so it gives a better fit. And then I'll be adding my side seam allowance, which is 1.5 inches. I wanted to do 2 inches, but I ended up using 1.5. So I marked a quarter of my waist circumference, added 1 inch for darts plus 1.5 for the side seam allowance. Now, still on the waistline, I'm marking half of my bust span measurement away from the center front. So my bust span measurement is 8 inches, half of that is 4, so I'm going in by 4 inches. And I'll mark the same point along the hip line. So on the hip line, I'm going in by 4 inches as well. I'll go ahead and use my ruler to connect the 2 points together in a straight line. And we're doing this to create the dart for the front. For a skirt, the front dart generally starts 2 inches above the hip line. So I'll be coming up from the hip line along that vertical line by 2 inches. And then along the waistline, I'm marking half an inch on either side of the vertical line. And then I'll go on to connect the 2 points to the 2 inches I marked earlier. So I'll be bringing in my straight ruler and I'll connect the first leg of the dart to meet the 2 inches. I'll do the same for the other dart leg as well, and there's the front dart. Now I'm going to be lowering the waistline along the center front by half an inch, and then I'll be raising it on this other end by half an inch as well. This will help the skirt sit better along the waistline. And I'll be connecting each of the points to meet each leg of the dart. Now before I connect the first dart leg to the point I marked along the center front, I'll be closing up the dart like this, just like I'm doing. Then I'll bring in my ruler to connect the points together. I'll connect the second dart leg to the points on the side, and that will be all for the waistline. Now let's move on to the hip line. Along the hip line, I'll simply be marking a quarter of my hip circumference plus 1.5 inches for the side seam allowance. And then I'll go on to connect the hip line to the waistline. Ideally, you should use a pant curve or a pattern master for this, but I have neither, so I'm just using my French curve to connect the 2 points together. I'll also be connecting it upwards to meet the 0.5 I marked earlier. Now for the hemline, I'll be subtracting 2 inches from the total measurement I have here on the hip line. That's what will give that pencil effect, but if you want the skirt straight, you can go ahead and mark the same measurement you have on the hip line for the hemline. So the total measurement I had on the hip line was 12.5 inches. I'll be taking away 2 inches, making it 10.5, and that's what I'm marking on the hemline. And after doing that, I'll go ahead to connect the hip line to the hemline using my straight ruler. So that's it for the front pattern. I'll go on to cancel out the old waistline and then cut along the lines I've marked. And then I'll go on to indicate that the center front is to be cut on a fold. I'll also be indicating that half an inch allowance should be added along the waistline when cutting onto fabric. And that's it. I'll be taking this away and moving on to work on the back pattern. So I'll be using a fresh pattern paper for the back, and the first thing I did was to come in by 1.5 from the edge of my pattern paper. That 1.5 will be used for my zipper allowance, and from there I drew out two vertical lines that will serve as my border with a width of 13 inches. I also came down from the top of my pattern paper by 1 inch and drew a line across that will serve as my start line / waistline. So just like I did for the front pattern, I'll be taking all my measurements from that line, starting with my waist to hip measurement at 8.5 inches. And that will be my hip line. Then I'll also be taking the full length, which is 23 inches. So the same measurement I marked for the front pattern is what I'm marking here. Now back to the waistline, I'm marking a quarter of my waist circumference, just like I did for the front, plus 1 inch for the dart and 1.5 inch for the side seam allowance. Then along the hip line, I'm marking a quarter of my hip circumference plus 1.5 inches for the side seam allowance. I'll go ahead and connect the waistline to the hip line using my French curve. Then I'll go back to the waistline to work on the darts for the back. So after the zipper allowance, I'm coming in by 4 inches, which is half of my bust band measurement. I'll mark the same thing along the hip line as well. Then I'll bring in my ruler to connect the 2 points together in a straight line. Then on the waistline, I'll be marking half an inch on either side of that vertical line, after which I'll be coming up by 3 inches from the hip line along the vertical line. Remember, for the front pattern, we came up by 2 inches, but the back dart is usually 1 inch shorter than the front. So I came up by 3 inches. Now just go ahead and connect all the points together like this. So I won't be dropping the waistline along the center back for the back pattern because that won't be necessary. But I'll be raising the side by half an inch so it can match the side of the front pattern when stitching together. So I'll just go ahead and connect that point to meet the dart leg. Then I'll blend it back to the waistline like this. And finally, I'll be connecting the hip line to the hemline. So I'll be taking away 2 inches from the total measurement I have on the hip line, and I'm marking that point along the hemline. Then I'll be bringing in my ruler to connect the hip line all the way to the hemline. And that's it. I'll go ahead to indicate the center back, and to also note that I'll be cutting out 2 pieces using this pattern. Now, if you want a slit at the back of the skirt, you'll be creating it along the center back, and the length of the slit totally depends on you. Just measure how long you want your slit to be and go ahead and mark that. So yeah, now I'll just go in with my scissors and cut along the lines. Then I'll also indicate that half an inch allowance should be added along the waistline when cutting it out. And guys, that's it. That's basically how to draft a basic skirt pattern. So we've come to the end of this video. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you in my next video.